Good evening, dear listeners. Welcome to this tranquil corner of history, where the soothing embrace of the past invites you to unwind and relax. Tonight, we will embark on a gentle journey through time, exploring a topic that may seem mundane at first glance but holds a certain charm in its intricacies: the tedious history of Roman census form completion guidelines. As you settle into your cozy space, perhaps snuggling under a soft blanket or resting your head on a plush pillow, allow the weight of the day to slip away. This is a moment for you, a time to let your thoughts drift like leaves on a gentle stream, and immerse yourself in the calming cadence of history. The Roman census, a vital element of ancient governance, was not merely a bureaucratic exercise, it was a reflection of the society's values, organization, and ambitions. In the coming moments, we will explore the origins of the census, tracing its roots back to the early days of Rome, when the need to account for citizens and resources became paramount. We will uncover the meticulous guidelines that governed how these forms were completed, revealing the careful consideration that was given to each individual and family in the vast Roman Empire. We will share stories of the citizens who participated in this process, their experiences, and the significance of their contributions. Through their eyes, we will witness the intricate dance of numbers and identities, a tapestry woven from the threads of many lives, each one echoing through time. The challenges they faced, the regulations they followed, and the eventual evolution of the census will all be part of our soothing narrative. As we delve deeper, we will ponder the importance of record-keeping in maintaining the fabric of society, how it influenced taxation, military service, and representation. The guidelines that emerged over the centuries reflect not only the administrative needs of an empire but also the human stories behind the statistics. So let your mind wander, freed from the worries of the modern world. Let us embrace the methodical nature of the Roman administrative process, allowing the rhythm of our exploration to lull you into a state of calm. Together, we will find peace in the details, the very essence of what makes history resonate, even in its most seemingly tedious moments. As we transition into our main content, I invite you to breathe deeply and allow the soothing sounds of history to wash over you. With each word, feel yourself drifting further into relaxation, your thoughts becoming lighter as we embark on this serene voyage through the ages. Now, let us begin our exploration of the Roman census and the guidelines that shaped this fascinating aspect of ancient life. Close your eyes if you wish, or keep them gently open, focusing on the soft flow of the narrative ahead. Welcome to the calming journey through the past. Narrative. The origins of the Roman census can be traced back to the establishment of the Roman Republic in the 6th century BCE. The first recorded census, known as the lustrum, occurred in census 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 in census. In census 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 in the construction methods and materials used in the implementation of census form completion were remarkably standardized, reflecting the meticulous administrative practices of the Roman Empire. Beginning in the early days of the Republic, around 509 BCE, the creation of census-related documents was initially rudimentary, utilizing materials such as papyrus and, later, parchment, which became prevalent by the 1st century BCE. The Roman government mandated the use of specific dimensions for census tablets, with a typical size measuring approximately 24 centimeters by 36 centimeters. This uniformity ensured that all census forms could be easily stored and transported. The construction of these forms necessitated lumber for the frames used to hold the tablets during the writing phase. Most commonly, wood sourced from the abundant forests of Gaul and Germania was employed. The preferred species included oak and ash due to their durability. This lumber was typically cut to lengths of 2 meters and processed to create a flat surface for writing. The creation of these frames involved the use of dovetail joints, a technique that had been utilized in Roman carpentry since at least the 2nd century BCE. Maintenance procedures for census records were rigorously outlined as well. After the completion of each census, which occurred every 5 years, the forms were stored in designated governmental archives. These archives were constructed with meticulous attention to humidity control, as excessive moisture could lead to the deterioration of parchment. The Romans employed clay pots filled with calcium carbonate to absorb moisture from the air, a technique that dates back to the 1st century CE. Annual inspections of the storage facilities were mandated, with records of these inspections maintained on a secondary set of forms known as tabulae inspectiones. Each inspection required a report detailing any observed degradation, and any damaged forms were to be replaced within a 3-month period. Financial records and costs associated with the census were equally detailed. The census of 28 BCE, famously commissioned by Emperor Augustus, allocated a budget of 3 million sesterces for the entire operation. This amount was divided into various categories, including the cost of materials, labor, and the compensation for census officials. For example, the remuneration for scribes responsible for recording data was set at 10 sesterces per day, a rate that remained consistent throughout the early empire. Additionally, an estimated 1,000 sesterces were allocated for ink production, which was primarily made from carbon black and water, with a binding agent derived from animal glue. Personnel and job descriptions related to census operations were strictly delineated. The role of the census official, or censor, was paramount, with a typical censor being a male of senatorial rank responsible for overseeing the entire process. Censors were elected every 5 years, with the first recorded use of this position occurring in 443 BCE. Each censor was accompanied by a staff of approximately 20 scribes, whose responsibilities included the meticulous recording of names, property holdings, and other pertinent data. These scribes were usually young men in their late teens to early 20s, often from well-respected families, and they underwent rigorous training in writing techniques and the use of styluses. Technical specifications for the census forms were outlined in a series of legal decrees, with the most significant being the Lex Censoria, enacted in 104 BCE. This decree mandated that all personal information must be recorded in a consistent format, including fields for name, age, property ownership, and family members. Each entry was required to be written in a specific script, known as capitalis monumentalis, which was characterized by its clear, legible letters. The ink used for writing was mandated to have a standard viscosity to ensure that the scripts did not smudge, a common issue noted in records from the mid-1st century CE. In addition to the aforementioned specifications, the census forms also included designated margins, with a width of 2 centimeters on the left and right sides. This was to ensure that when the forms were bound or stacked, the writing would remain unobscured. The use of a tabula rasa format, which allowed for the erasure and rewriting of entries, became commonplace by 30 CE, allowing for flexibility in data input as populations fluctuated. The record-keeping process was further complicated by the requirement for verification of entries. Following the submission of completed forms, a secondary official known as the revisor would compare the entries against a master list, a practice first documented in the 3rd century CE. This verification process was crucial to maintaining the integrity of the census data, particularly as the Roman Empire expanded and the diversity of its populace increased. The financial implications of this extensive bureaucratic process cannot be overstated. The costs associated with the census were generally covered by the provincial budgets, with each province required to allocate a specific percentage of its tax revenue to support census operations. For example, by 200 CE, provinces like Hispania Tarraconensis were contributing approximately 5% of their annual tax income to fund these activities. This allocation was often a point of contention among provincial governors, as it directly impacted their available resources for local governance. In summary, the construction methods and materials, maintenance procedures, financial records and costs, personnel and job descriptions, and technical specifications related to Roman census form completion were characterized by a level of detail and organization that is often overlooked in broader historical accounts. The processes established by the Romans not only facilitated the collection of demographic data but also laid the groundwork for future administrative practices in various cultures that followed. The legacy of these meticulous guidelines remains evident in modern governance, as the principles of accuracy, accountability, and systematic record-keeping continue to be vital components of census operations worldwide. The construction methods and materials used in the implementation of census form completion were remarkably standardized, reflecting the meticulous administrative practices of the Roman Empire. Beginning in the early days of the Republic, around 509 BCE, the creation of census-related documents was initially rudimentary, utilizing materials such as papyrus and, later, parchment, which became prevalent by the 1st century BCE. The Roman government mandated the use of specific dimensions for census tablets, often crafted to a standard size of approximately 30 by 20 centimeters, allowing for uniformity in record keeping. In the earlier years of the Republic, the census was conducted approximately every 5 years, a practice formalized by the Lex Claudia in 218 BCE. This law was a significant advancement in the administrative processes of the state, as it helped to ensure that the population data was not only collected but also regularly updated. The census was overseen by officials known as censors, who were entrusted with the responsibility of maintaining public morals as well as counting the citizens. The first census conducted under this new system took place in 443 BCE, and it recorded the number of Roman citizens, their wealth, and their property, which were critical for tax and military service purposes. By the late Republic and into the early Empire, particularly under Augustus in 27 BCE, the practice of census-taking evolved into a more sophisticated system. Augustus implemented a more centralized approach, conducting a census every 14 years, known as the Augustan census. This census was meticulously documented, and the results were inscribed on bronze tablets that were displayed publicly in the forum, ensuring transparency and accountability. The inscriptions were not merely administrative records but also served as a testament to Augustus's power and the organization of the empire. The materials used for these records were indicative of the era's technological advancements. While papyrus was favored in the earlier centuries, the shift to parchment allowed for more durable and long-lasting records. Parchment, made from animal skins, provided a smoother writing surface, enabling scribes to produce detailed and legible documents. The invention of ink, often made from carbon black mixed with various binders, allowed for finer writing instruments, such as the stylus and reed pens, which were essential for the preparation of the census documents. One notable example of the Roman census process can be seen in the census of 6 CE, which was conducted in the provinces of Judea and Galilee. This census is historically significant, as it prompted widespread unrest among the Jewish population, leading to the rise of movements opposing Roman rule. The census required individuals to return to their ancestral homes to register, a process that can be likened to modern-day voter registration drives. The Roman Empire expected a high compliance rate, and failure to register could result in penalties, including confiscation of property or even enslavement. The precision of the Roman census extended beyond mere population counts. It also included detailed demographic data such as age, occupation, and property ownership. This information was critical for the empire's tax system, which relied on accurate assessments of wealth and resources. In fact, the term census itself, census in Latin, is derived from the verb censere, meaning to assess or estimate, highlighting its dual role in governance and fiscal policy. The processes involved in collecting and recording census data were systematic. The censors and their assistants would travel throughout the provinces, visiting towns and villages, and gathering data through a series of interviews with heads of households. These interviews would often take place in public squares or community centers, fostering a sense of communal responsibility. The gathered information would then be meticulously transcribed onto the standardized census forms, which were sometimes sealed and stored in public archives for future reference. Historically, the importance of the census cannot be understated. It provided the Roman state with essential information needed to maintain order and allocate resources effectively. The data collected influenced military recruitment, taxation, and even the distribution of food supplies during times of famine. During the reign of Emperor Trajan, 98 to 117 CE, for instance, precise census data was crucial for managing the grain supply to Rome, a city that relied heavily on imports from other parts of the empire. Furthermore, The legacy of Roman census practices can be seen in the administrative methods of later civilizations. The Byzantine Empire, which succeeded Rome, continued the tradition of census-taking, known as the logos. The meticulous record-keeping established by the Romans served as a foundation for modern census practices, influencing how countries around the world conduct their population surveys today. In conclusion, the construction methods and materials used in the implementation of census form completion during the Roman Empire reflect a rich tapestry of historical development, technological innovation, and administrative sophistication that laid the groundwork for governance practices that persist in various forms to this day. The construction methods and materials employed in the Roman census form completion processes were reflective of the broader architectural and administrative practices of the Roman state. The primary materials utilized for the physical documentation involved papyrus and later parchment, which was derived from animal skins. Papyrus, a plant-based material that originated from the Nile, was particularly favored for its durability and availability in the Mediterranean region. In contrast, parchment became increasingly popular after the 4th century AD, when the supply of papyrus became inconsistent due to various geopolitical factors. The dimensions of the census forms varied depending on the specific requirements of the census at hand. A standard papyrus sheet typically measured around 30 cm by 50 cm, allowing for ample space to inscribe the required information. The forms were inscribed with a stylus or reed pen, often utilizing ink made from soot mixed with water and gum arabic to ensure legibility. The inscription process itself was meticulous, with a standard line height of approximately 1.5 centimeters to facilitate clear writing. Maintenance procedures for these documents were crucial, as the longevity of the census records depended on careful handling and storage. The Roman authorities established protocols for the preservation of census forms that included keeping them in climate-controlled environments, often within wooden or metal chests, to protect them from humidity and pests. Regular inspections were mandated, typically occurring every 5 years, during which officials would assess the condition of the documents and replace any that had deteriorated beyond usability. This maintenance process included the use of oils to treat the surfaces of the documents, ensuring they remained pliable and resistant to cracking. Financial records pertaining to the census operations were meticulously maintained, with costs associated with material procurement, personnel wages, and administrative overhead being carefully documented. The annual budget for the census could range widely, but records from the late Republic indicate expenditures of approximately 1,000 denarii per census event. These expenses covered not only the procurement of papyrus and ink but also the remuneration of scribes and other personnel involved in the census process. In the early empire, the costs increased significantly, reaching upwards of 5,000 denarii by the 2nd century AD, largely due to inflation and the increased complexity of the census operations. The personnel involved in the census were diverse, encompassing a range of roles, each with specific job descriptions and responsibilities. The primary figure was the census taker, or censor, who was responsible for overseeing the entire process. The censor had to be a Roman citizen of high standing, often a former magistrate, and was charged with ensuring the accuracy and integrity of the records. Their duties included instructing subordinate officials, known as census scribes, who were tasked with collecting data from households and recording it accurately on the census forms. Census scribes typically underwent rigorous training, often spending years as apprentices under experienced officials. They were expected to possess strong literacy skills, including familiarity with legal terminology and mathematical calculations for population and property assessments. Additionally, a group of assistants known as lictors was employed to help maintain order and assist in the logistics of the census-taking process. Lictors had the authority to enforce compliance among the populace, ensuring that all citizens participated in the census and provided accurate information. The technical specifications of the census forms themselves evolved over time, reflecting the changing needs of the Roman administration. Initially, the forms were relatively simple, requiring basic demographic information such as the name, age, and property holdings of each individual. However, as the empire expanded, the forms became more complex, incorporating additional fields for taxation purposes, military service eligibility, and even religious affiliation. By the 3rd century AD, the standard census form included sections for the recording of property values, household composition, and even details regarding livestock and agricultural production. To facilitate the processing of this information, the Romans developed a system of standardized abbreviations and symbols that could be inscribed quickly onto the forms. For instance, a common abbreviation for male was M, and for female was F. Furthermore, numeric symbols were utilized to indicate quantities, such as the Roman numerals I, V, and X for 1, 5, and 10, respectively. This shorthand not only expedited the recording process but also minimized the risk of errors in transcription. The census process was typically conducted every 5 years, a practice initiated by Servius Tullius in the 6th century BC. This quinquennial cycle became a cornerstone of Roman civic life, allowing for regular updates to population data and ensuring that the taxation system remained equitable. By the time of Augustus, the census was formalized into a bureaucratic routine, with each census event meticulously planned and executed. The central government coordinated with local magistrates to ensure that all regions of the empire adhered to the established guidelines. In terms of logistical considerations, the census required extensive planning. The Roman state would distribute detailed instructions to local officials well in advance of the census date. These instructions included the timeline for data collection, the specific forms to be used, and the penalties for non-compliance. A typical timeline allowed for a 3-month data collection period, during which census takers would move through the provinces, often traveling long distances on foot or horseback to reach remote settlements. As the census process became more sophisticated, technological innovations emerged to aid in the completion of census forms. The introduction of the abacus, a counting tool, allowed census scribes to perform calculations more quickly and accurately. This device, which consisted of a series of rods or wires strung with beads, enabled officials to tally populations and property values efficiently. By the 1st century AD, some census offices began experimenting with early forms of accounting ledgers, which provided a more organized method for tracking census data over time. The financial implications of the census were significant, as the information gathered directly impacted tax revenues and military conscription. The Roman state relied heavily on accurate population counts to determine the appropriate tax rates for various provinces. For example, in 6 AD, under the reign of Augustus, the census revealed a population of about 4.1 million citizens within Italy alone. This figure was instrumental in adjusting tax policies, leading to a 10% increase in revenue from the provinces. Furthermore, the census served as a critical tool for military organization. Accurate records of eligible males allowed the Roman military to maintain an effective fighting force. The data collected were used to identify potential recruits for the legions and to allocate resources for military campaigns. By the time of the late Empire, the census data had expanded to include not only demographic information but also assessments of military readiness within each province. The technical specifications of the forms evolved in response to the growing complexities of governance. By the late 2nd century AD, the forms had expanded to include sections for recording individual household income, land tenure, and even the number of slaves owned by each household. This level of detail was unprecedented and signified the increasing bureaucracy of the Roman state. In conclusion, the history of Roman census form completion guidelines is a detailed account of the evolution of administrative practices, demonstrating the interplay between construction methods, maintenance procedures, financial management, personnel roles, and technical specifications. The meticulous nature of these practices laid a foundation for modern census operations, emphasizing the importance of accurate record-keeping in governance. As the Roman Empire expanded, so too did the complexity of its census operations, illustrating the necessity for adaptability and innovation in the face of administrative challenges. The construction methods and materials utilized in the various census-related infrastructure during the Roman era were, like many aspects of Roman engineering, characterized by meticulous attention to detail and an understanding of the available resources. The primary materials employed in the construction of census offices, gathering places, and other related facilities included stone, brick, and wood, each selected based on the specific requirements of durability, availability, and local building traditions. The foundational work often commenced with the excavation of the site, which was typically 1.5 to 2 meters deep, depending on the local soil conditions. The Romans favored using a concrete mixture known as opus cementitium, which was composed of lime, volcanic ash, and aggregates. This mixture was favored for its strength and durability, allowing structures to withstand the test of time. The walls were generally erected to a thickness of 0.6 to 1 meter, offering both stability and insulation against the elements. In the construction of roofs, timber was commonly used, particularly from local forests. The Romans employed a method known as trabeatio, which involved a series of wooden beams supporting a tiled roof. The tiles were typically made from terracotta and measured approximately 30 centimeters by 60 centimeters, providing effective waterproofing. The angle of the roof was standardized to approximately 30 degrees to facilitate rain runoff. Maintenance procedures for census-related buildings were equally structured and procedural. It was not uncommon for local officials to conduct biannual inspections, typically in March and September, to assess the condition of these structures. The maintenance regimen included the clearing of debris from roofs and gutters, as well as the repair of any cracks or structural weaknesses. Specific tools such as chisels, ferramentum, hammers, malleus, and trowels, pala, were employed in these efforts. Records indicate that a budget of approximately 1,000 sesterces was allocated annually for minor repairs, while major renovations could exceed 5,000 sesterces, depending on the extent of the work needed. Financial records related to the census operations were typically maintained in a ledger known as the codex. Each entry recorded the expenses associated with construction, maintenance, and personnel salaries. For example, in the year 27 BCE, it is noted that expenditures for the census offices in Rome alone amounted to 15,000 sesterces, with a breakdown indicating that 9,000 sesterces were allocated for construction materials, 3,000 for labor, and 3,000 for administrative costs. Personnel involved in the census operations were classified into several distinct roles, each with specific job descriptions. The primary position was that of the censitor, responsible for overseeing the entire census process. This individual was typically a Roman citizen of senatorial rank, tasked with ensuring that all procedures were followed according to established guidelines. Censitors were required to possess a thorough understanding of both the legal and administrative aspects of the census, as well as the ability to manage a team effectively. Under the censitor were the scribi, or scribes, whose primary responsibility was to record the information collected during the census. Each scribe was expected to maintain a high level of accuracy in their entries, often utilizing wax tablets and styluses for initial drafts before transferring the data to permanent scrolls. A typical scribe could process approximately 100 entries per day, and their work was subject to rigorous checks by the censor. Additionally, there were the ex-census, tasked with assisting in the collection of data from the citizens. This role required individuals to visit households and gather information, including names, property ownership, and family composition. The ex-census were expected to carry a standardized list of questions, which was revised periodically based on demographic changes. The average ex-census worked in teams of 3 and was responsible for covering approximately 200 households over a week-long period. Technical specifications for the census form itself evolved over time, reflecting the increased complexity of Roman society. The earliest forms, dating back to the Republic period, were relatively simple, requiring only basic demographic information. However, by the time of Emperor Augustus in 6 CE, the census form had evolved to include a detailed enumeration of property values, social status, and citizenship classification. The forms were typically made of papyrus or parchment, with a standardized size of 24 cm by 36 cm. Each form contained specific fields for recording information, including sections for the name of the head of the household, the number of individuals residing at the address, and a detailed inventory of property, including farmland, livestock, and household goods. The layout was designed to facilitate quick data entry, with clear demarcations for each section. The implementation of the census form was accompanied by a strict timeline. Each census was mandated to occur every 5 years, with the first day of January designated as the start date for data collection. Local officials were instructed to complete their surveys within a 90-day period, after which the forms were to be submitted to the central administration for compilation and analysis. In summary, the various aspects of the Roman census form completion guidelines reflect the empire's commitment to effective governance and administrative efficiency. Through careful construction methods, maintenance procedures, financial oversight, personnel management, and technical specifications, the Romans established a framework that not only supported the census process but also provided a model for future administrative practices. The interplay of these elements illustrates the complexity of governance in the Roman Empire, where even the most mundane tasks, such as form completion, were executed with a level of precision indicative of the era's broader administrative ethos. As the empire continued to expand, the lessons learned from these initial census operations would inform future administrative efforts, ensuring that the Roman state remained responsive to the needs of its diverse population. Thus, the history of Roman census form completion guidelines stands as a testament to the intricacies of administrative practice within one of history's most storied empires, encapsulating a legacy of order, regulation, and the pursuit of knowledge that would endure long after the fall of Rome. The construction methods and materials utilized in the various census-related infrastructure during the Roman era were, like many aspects of Roman engineering, characterized by meticulous attention to detail and an understanding of the available resources. The primary materials employed in the construction of census offices, gathering places, and other related facilities included stone, brick, and wood, each selected based on the specific requirements of durability, availability, and local building traditions. The Roman census, a systematic counting and assessment of the population, was vital for taxation and military conscription. The first census in Rome is believed to have been conducted in 508 BC under the rule of the first consuls, but the practice became more formalized under Augustus in 27 BC, with subsequent censuses occurring every 5 years, culminating in tax assessments and military recruitment that shaped the empire's structure. By the time of Augustus, the census was not merely a counting of citizens but an extensive administrative process that necessitated the construction of specialized buildings to house records and facilitate gatherings for the populace. In Rome, the construction of these census facilities often began with the selection of strategic locations, typically near populous areas or major roads to ensure accessibility. The Forum Romanum, for instance, served as a central hub for various governmental functions, including census activities. Here, structures such as the Tabularium, built in 78 BC, housed public records and census data. This impressive building, constructed from Travertine limestone, measures around 40 meters in length, showcasing the grandeur and importance placed on record-keeping. The materials used in Roman constructions were selected based on both practical and aesthetic considerations. Stone was favored for its durability and longevity. It was particularly prevalent in regions near quarries, such as the Tiber Valley, where limestone and tuff could be easily sourced. For example, in the provinces, local materials were often used to construct census-related infrastructure. In Gaul, for instance, census buildings might have been made from the region's native limestone or clay bricks, which were fired to create durable structures capable of withstanding the elements. In contrast, wood was commonly used for temporary structures or smaller offices, particularly in regions where timber was abundant. For the construction process itself, Roman builders employed a range of techniques that reflected their advanced understanding of engineering. The use of the arch, for instance, allowed for the construction of larger and more stable structures. This technique was evident in buildings like the Basilica Oppia, completed in AD 113 during the reign of Trajan, which served as an administrative center. Its grand vaulted ceilings and expansive open spaces provided an ideal venue for public gatherings and census activities. The basilica measured approximately 100 meters long and 50 meters wide, demonstrating the scale at which Roman architects operated. In addition to the physical structures, the Roman census was supported by a complex administrative system. Census officials, known as the censors, were responsible for overseeing the counting process, which included not just the enumeration of people but also the assessment of wealth and property. This dual function necessitated the construction of secure storage areas for sensitive financial records, typically located within or adjacent to census offices. These facilities were often equipped with locking mechanisms and sometimes reinforced with iron bars to prevent unauthorized access. The historical context of these infrastructures can be traced back to the earlier Roman Republic, where the need for organized record-keeping became apparent as the population grew. By the time of the late Republic, the increasing complexity of Roman society required more sophisticated administrative solutions. The development of the census as a regular institution reflected not just a shift in governance but also an evolving understanding of citizenship and statehood. For instance, the Lex Julia of 18 BC expanded the concept of citizenship to include various provincial populations, which meant that census facilities had to accommodate a more diverse citizenry. Case studies of specific census-related infrastructures provide further insight into the Romans' engineering prowess. The city of Pompeii, preserved under volcanic ash, showcases various small census offices scattered throughout the city, often located near public spaces like the Forum. These structures, while less grand than their counterparts in Rome, were nonetheless constructed with an eye toward functionality and accessibility, featuring open areas for public interaction and record-keeping. Overall, the construction of census-related infrastructures during the Roman era reflects a confluence of engineering expertise, administrative necessity, and the socio-political landscape of the time. The enduring legacy of these buildings not only highlights the Romans' architectural achievements but also underscores the importance of the census in shaping the fabric of Roman society. Through the continued study of these structures, historians gain valuable insights into the daily lives of the Romans and the systems that governed them. The construction methods and materials utilized in the Roman census infrastructure were as varied and meticulous as the procedures themselves. The primary materials employed in the construction of census-related facilities, such as public forums and administrative offices, included brick, tuff, and, in certain locales, marble. Brick was the most common material, primarily because of its availability and ease of manufacturing. Standard Roman bricks measured approximately 30 centimeters in length, 15 centimeters in width, and 5 centimeters in thickness. The use of tuff, a volcanic rock found near Rome, particularly in areas like the Alban Hills, provided structures with a degree of durability that was advantageous in the temperate climate of the Italian peninsula. The construction of census facilities typically adhered to strict architectural guidelines set forth by the Roman Senate. These guidelines were codified in various legal texts, most notably the Lex Julia de Civitate. Construction sites were often required to maintain a clear layout, with an emphasis on accessibility and functionality. For example, the public census offices, known as censoria, were often situated near the Forum Romanum, allowing for easy access by the citizenry. The average dimensions of a census office would measure approximately 200 square meters, with high ceilings reaching up to 4 meters to accommodate the necessary bureaucratic activities. Maintenance procedures for these facilities were governed by local magistrates known as aediles. Their responsibilities included the regular inspection of the structural integrity of the buildings and ensuring that the facilities met the needs of the populace. It was common practice for aediles to conduct inspections biannually, particularly before the commencement of census activities. Maintenance tasks often included the repair of damaged walls, the replacement of roofing tiles, and the cleaning of public areas to ensure that the facilities remained functional and presentable. The materials used for maintenance were often sourced from local suppliers, as transportation of heavy materials over long distances could incur significant costs and logistical challenges. The financial records and costs associated with the census process were meticulously documented, reflecting the importance of fiscal responsibility in Roman governance. According to historical records, the budgeting for census-related activities was typically allocated from the public treasury, known as the aerarium. This allocation varied depending on the size and significance of the census. For instance, the census conducted in 28 BCE under Emperor Augustus reportedly required an expenditure of approximately 1,200,000 sesterces. This cost included not only construction and maintenance but also the salaries of personnel involved in the census process. Personnel involved in the census were categorized into distinct roles, each with specific job descriptions and responsibilities. The primary officials overseeing the census were known as censors. These individuals were usually of senatorial rank, elected every 5 years, and responsible for conducting the census, as well as overseeing public morality and the allocation of public contracts. The role of a censor was highly esteemed, requiring not only a thorough understanding of legal and governmental procedures but also a keen sense of public ethics. Subordinate to the censors were a variety of aides and clerks known as scribi. Their primary responsibility was to record the names, ages, and property holdings of citizens during the census. Scribi were often chosen from among the ranks of freedmen, possessing a solid grasp of literacy and numeracy. Their work was essential to the accuracy of the census, as any errors in recording could lead to significant discrepancies in taxation and military conscription. The technical specifications of the census process itself were defined by a series of laws and regulations. The Lex Pallia, c. 65 BCE, established the fundamental framework for conducting the census, stipulating that it should occur every 5 years and that every citizen of Rome must participate. The process required the physical presence of citizens at designated locations, where they would provide information to the census officials. This was often conducted in open public spaces, such as the Forum or the Basilica, where citizens would queue to present their details. In terms of measurement, the census recorded significant details, including the height and age of male citizens, as well as the number of dependents in a household. For example, males over the age of 14 were required to provide their height, which was measured in feet and inches, following the Roman system where 1 foot equaled approximately 29.6 centimeters. This information was crucial for military conscription, as it allowed officials to ascertain the physical eligibility of citizens for military service. In addition to recording personal information, the census also involved the assessment of property. Property was classified into taxable categories, with specific measurements being used to determine the tax liability of each household. For instance, land holdings were measured in iujra, a unit equivalent to approximately 0.25 acres. The valuation of property was often conducted by a group of assessors known as quaestors, who estimated the worth based on various factors including location, fertility, and existing developments. Another essential aspect of the census was the collection of demographic data, which included information about the number of slaves owned by each household. This was particularly significant in understanding the economic strata of Roman society. The Lex Claudia, c. 218 BCE, mandated that census records must also include the number of slaves, which was essential for taxation and military service assessments. Slaves were counted as part of a household's wealth and influenced the overall taxation rates applied to landowners. As the census evolved, so too did the methods of data collection and processing. The introduction of wax tablets and styluses in the 1st century BCE allowed for more efficient record keeping. These tablets, typically measuring 15 centimeters by 25 centimeters, provided a reusable surface for scribes to record information. Following the census, the tablets would be stored in the archives of the aediles for future reference, allowing for a longitudinal study of demographic changes over time. The documentation of census data was not merely a bureaucratic formality, it served as a critical tool for understanding the socio-political landscape of Rome. The data collected informed key decisions regarding military recruitment, urban planning, and the distribution of public services. For example, the census conducted in 14 CE, shortly before the death of Augustus, revealed that the population of Rome had reached approximately 1 million inhabitants, a significant figure that would influence public policy and infrastructure development for decades to come. To ensure the accuracy and integrity of the census process, stringent penalties were established for falsifying information. The Lex Julia de Civitate included provisions for severe fines and, in some cases, exile for those found guilty of providing false data. This legal framework underscored the seriousness with which the Romans approached the census, recognizing it as a foundational element of their governance. In conclusion, the meticulous construction methods, maintenance procedures, financial records, personnel roles, and technical specifications surrounding the Roman census reflect a society deeply invested in governance and social order. The complex interplay of these elements created a system that not only facilitated the collection of vital demographic information but also shaped the very fabric of Roman society for centuries. By analyzing these aspects in detail, historians can gain a clearer understanding of the administrative mechanisms that underpinned one of the most influential civilizations in history. The Tedious History of Roman Census Form Completion Guidelines, Part 6. Regional Variations and Comparisons. The Roman Empire, with its vast expanse stretching from the windswept shores of Britain to the sun-drenched deserts of Egypt, was a patchwork of diverse cultures, languages, and, significantly, administrative practices. This diversity was particularly evident in the processes surrounding census form completion, which varied considerably from one region to another. Each province developed its own methods for gathering and reporting demographic data, influenced by local customs, governance structures, and even the prevailing attitudes towards the imperial authority. In the provinces of Gaul, for instance, the census was characterized by a more decentralized approach. Local chieftains and tribal leaders were often entrusted with the responsibility of gathering information from their communities. This reliance on local authority figures not only facilitated the process but also meant that the information collected was often imbued with regional biases. The Gauls, known for their fierce independence, sometimes resisted the imposition of imperial census guidelines, leading to discrepancies in the data reported to Rome. The differences in form completion were exacerbated by the varying literacy rates across the provinces. In areas where Latin was not widely spoken, census forms might be completed in local dialects, leading to further complications in interpretation and record keeping. In contrast, the provinces of Asia Minor exhibited a more standardized approach to census taking, largely due to the influence of Hellenistic administrative practices that had been absorbed into the Roman system. Cities such as Ephesus and Pergamon had well-established bureaucratic infrastructures, allowing for more uniformity in the completion of census forms. The use of Greek as the lingua franca in this region facilitated communication and comprehension, reducing the likelihood of errors stemming from language barriers. However, even here, local customs played a critical role. For example, the inclusion of certain social classes in the census varied, with some regions incorporating local elites who were otherwise exempt in other parts of the empire. Comparative studies of these regional practices reveal not only the complexities of Roman governance but also the challenges inherent in achieving a cohesive demographic overview of the entire empire. The discrepancies in data were not merely academic, they had real-world implications for tax collection, military conscription, and the distribution of resources. The Roman authorities were acutely aware of these variations and often attempted to institute reforms aimed at standardizing census practices across the provinces, albeit with mixed success. Evolution over different time periods. The process of census form completion in the Roman Empire did not remain static, rather, it evolved significantly over the centuries, reflecting broader socio-political changes and advancements in administrative technologies. The early Republic censors operated under relatively informal guidelines, often relying on public assemblies to gather information. This method, while effective in smaller communities, quickly became unwieldy as the population of Rome swelled and the empire expanded. By the late Republic and into the imperial period, the need for a more structured approach became evident. The introduction of written census forms marked a turning point in the evolution of census practices. These forms were typically inscribed on wax tablets, which allowed for easy modifications and reusability, a feature that would prove invaluable given the frequent updates required as populations shifted due to migration, warfare, and economic changes. The Romans' penchant for record-keeping led to the development of increasingly sophisticated forms, with headings and categories designed to capture a wide array of demographic information, including age, gender, occupation, and even property ownership. During the reign of Augustus, the census took on an even more significant role as a tool for consolidating imperial power. Augustus famously conducted a census in 28 BCE, which was not only a means of assessing taxation but also a way to legitimize his authority. The form completion guidelines during this period became more stringent, with an emphasis on accuracy and comprehensiveness. The establishment of the census, a term used to refer to the official records kept by the censors, ensured that detailed records were maintained, further entrenching the practice of meticulous data collection. As the empire faced challenges in the later centuries, including economic turmoil and invasions, the census adapted once more. The bureaucratic infrastructure began to fray, leading to a decline in the rigor with which forms were completed. Regional variations re-emerged as local authorities struggled to maintain compliance with imperial directives, often resorting to estimates rather than comprehensive counts. The rise of feudal practices in the later empire further complicated matters, as local lords and landowners began to assert more control over the census process, often skewing data to favor their interests. Bureaucratic regulations and laws. The Roman approach to census form completion was governed by a complex set of bureaucratic regulations and laws, which evolved alongside the administrative practices themselves. The Lex Aelia de Civitate, enacted in 90 BCE, was one such regulation that had profound implications for census practices. This law extended citizenship to certain non-Roman populations, necessitating a revision of census guidelines to accommodate the newly enfranchised citizens. The census forms had to be amended to include not only Roman citizens but also these new groups, creating a further layer of complexity in the data collection process. Moreover, the role of the censors, officials responsible for conducting the census, was defined by a series of legal stipulations that dictated not only how the census should be carried out but also the penalties for non-compliance. Violating regulations concerning the census could result in significant fines or even imprisonment. The censors were empowered to investigate discrepancies in reported data, a process that often involved extensive cross-referencing with other official records, such as property registries and tax rolls. The bureaucratic nature of these regulations also meant that the process became increasingly convoluted over time. As new laws were passed and old ones amended, the guidelines for census form completion grew more elaborate. By the time of the early empire, forms included not only demographic data but also fields for reporting on public health, infrastructure, and even agricultural yield, reflecting a growing interest in the socio-economic fabric of the empire. Supply chain and logistics. The logistics surrounding the distribution and collection of census forms were no less complex than the forms themselves. The Roman Empire, known for its sophisticated road networks and communication systems, utilized these assets to facilitate the movement of census materials. Each province was supplied with a standardized set of forms, dispatched from central administrative hubs in Italy. The logistics of this operation were immense. Hundreds of thousands of forms needed to be printed, transported, and delivered to local authorities, all while ensuring that they arrived in a timely manner to coincide with the official census dates. The supply chain was further complicated by the necessity to account for local variations in form completion. Different provinces often required tailored forms to accommodate local languages and customs, necessitating a more intricate logistics operation. This regional customization led to the establishment of local depots where forms could be printed on-site, reducing transit times and allowing for immediate adjustments based on local feedback. However, this decentralization introduced its own challenges, as variations in form quality and adherence to imperial guidelines could lead to inconsistencies across the empire. Moreover, the logistics of collecting completed forms presented a unique set of difficulties. Once the census period concluded, local officials were responsible for gathering the forms and ensuring they were forwarded to the central authorities. This process was often hindered by communication breakdowns, particularly in remote areas where the imperial presence was less pronounced. The reliance on couriers and local messengers meant that delays were common, leading to instances where census data was not reported for months, if not years, after the forms were completed. Such delays not only skewed the data but also hindered the ability of the Roman administration to effectively respond to changing demographic trends. Record-keeping methods. The methods employed for record-keeping in relation to census data were as varied as the forms themselves. In the early years, simple lists inscribed on wax tablets sufficed for maintaining records. These tablets were easily portable, allowing censors to carry them during inspections and audits. However, as the complexity of the census grew, so too did the need for more durable and comprehensive record-keeping methods. The introduction of parchment and papyrus as mediums for record-keeping represented a significant advancement in the preservation of census data. These materials allowed for more permanent records, reducing the likelihood of data loss due to wear and tear. The development of the tabularium, a public archive where census records were stored, marked a turning point in the administration of census data. These archives became critical repositories of information, meticulously organized to allow for easy retrieval of data for tax assessments, military conscription, and other administrative purposes. By the late Republic and into the imperial period, record-keeping practices became increasingly sophisticated. The use of standardized forms meant that data could be compiled and analyzed more systematically. Official records of census data were kept in triplicate, one set for local authorities, another for provincial administrators, and a third to be sent to Rome. This redundancy was essential for ensuring that discrepancies could be identified and rectified promptly. However, the reliance on bureaucracy also meant that record-keeping could become mired in inefficiencies, with forms often lost in transit or misfiled within the vast bureaucratic systems. Furthermore, the advent of legal reforms, such as those enacted under Augustus, necessitated the creation of additional records that documented compliance with census regulations. These supplementary records often included notations about individuals who failed to register or discrepancies noted by censors during their inspections. The meticulous nature of these record-keeping practices not only reflects the Roman commitment to administrative efficiency but also highlights the lengths to which the empire would go to maintain control over its population. In conclusion, the history of Roman census form completion guidelines is a labyrinthine narrative characterized by regional variations, bureaucratic complexities, logistical challenges, and evolving record-keeping methods. As the empire expanded and diversified, these processes adapted to the changing socio-political landscape, reflecting the interplay between local customs and imperial authority. The legacy of these practices continues to resonate within the annals of history, offering a glimpse into the meticulous nature of Roman governance and the enduring importance of accurate demographic data in the administration of a vast and diverse empire. ### The Tedious History of Roman Census Form Completion Guidelines, Parts 7 to 11. ### Part 7, Regional Variations and Comparisons. The Roman Empire, an intricate tapestry of cultures, languages, and governance structures, exhibited significant regional variations in census form completion, reflecting local customs and administrative practices. The centralization of census activities, while a hallmark of Roman authority, did not eliminate the distinct methodologies that emerged in different provinces. In the provinces of Gaul, for instance, the census process was often influenced by the indigenous Celtic practices. Local chieftains played a crucial role in the gathering of data, which resulted in a more communal approach to census completion. In contrast, the provinces of Egypt adhered closely to the directives issued from the central Roman authorities, primarily due to the significant presence of bureaucratic administrators who often possessed a keen understanding of the central policies. The Egyptians utilized papyrus scrolls for recording census data, which differed markedly from the wax tablets common in the Latin-speaking regions. This divergence highlighted not only a regional variation in materials but also in methods of data collection, as the Egyptians were known to employ a more hierarchical approach, often relying on local tax collectors to relay information upwards. In the eastern provinces, particularly in Asia Minor, a blend of local customs and Roman practices emerged. The census there involved a more elaborate process that entailed public gatherings where citizens were encouraged to declare their possessions openly. This practice can be traced back to Hellenistic traditions of accountability and community engagement, contrasting sharply with the more private methods employed in the western provinces, where individuals often filled out their forms in solitude, reflecting a cultural predisposition toward individualism. Comparative analysis reveals that while the underlying principles of the census remained consistent, gathering demographic and economic data, the execution was tailored to fit local traditions, demonstrating the Roman Empire's adaptability and the varying degrees of local autonomy. Such variations had lasting implications for the administrative efficiency of the empire, influencing taxation systems and resource allocation in ways that reverberated through the centuries. ### Part 8, Evolution over different time periods. The evolution of Roman census form completion guidelines spans several centuries, marked by significant shifts in administrative philosophy and societal needs. Initially, the census was a rudimentary tool for military conscription and tax assessment, primarily focused on headcounts and property valuation. However, As the empire expanded, the complexities of governance necessitated a more sophisticated approach. During the early republic, the census was conducted every 5 years and involved a simple tally of citizens and their assets. The completion guidelines were minimal, focusing on essential information such as family size and property ownership. However, as the population surged and urbanization increased, the inadequacies of these guidelines became apparent. By the late Republic, the census evolved to include more detailed classifications, such as social status and occupation, reflecting the growing importance of socioeconomic stratification within Roman society. The transition to the imperial period marked a significant turning point. The census became more frequent, often occurring annually, as emperors sought to maintain tighter control over their vast territories. During this time, the guidelines expanded to include intricate details about citizenship status, regional affiliations, and even religious practices. Emperor Augustus, in particular, instituted reforms that standardized the census process across the empire, establishing a comprehensive framework that would endure for centuries. This era witnessed the introduction of formal training for census takers, ensuring that they adhered to the evolving guidelines and maintained a consistent level of accuracy. By the late Empire, the census had become an essential tool for managing the complexities of a diverse population. The guidelines reflected the need to account for various ethnic groups, languages, and local customs. The data collected were not merely for taxation or military purposes, they were also utilized to gauge public sentiment and inform policy decisions. This shift marked a departure from the earlier, more simplistic approaches, underscoring the evolving role of the census in Roman governance. Part 9 Bureaucratic Regulations and Laws. The bureaucratic framework surrounding Roman census form completion was as intricate as the forms themselves. Various laws and regulations governed the procedures, establishing a series of protocols that were to be meticulously followed. The Lex Julia, enacted under Augustus, was instrumental in codifying census regulations, outlining the obligations of citizens and officials alike. Under this legislation, citizens were required to present themselves for the census at designated locations, often local forums or temples, where they would be registered by appointed officials known as censors. The censors, tasked with overseeing the census, wielded considerable power, including the authority to expel citizens from the rolls for non-compliance. This regulation highlighted the intertwining of civic duty and legal obligation, as failure to participate could result in penalties ranging from fines to loss of citizenship privileges. The meticulous nature of these regulations extended to the specifications of the forms themselves. Each form had to include precise categories for information, such as family lineage, property type, including land, livestock, and slaves, and income sources. The Roman legal code mandated that these forms be completed in Latin, thereby reinforcing the cultural hegemony of the Latin language across the empire. Moreover, the regulations stipulated that the data had to be verified through a series of checks and balances, including witness attestations and secondary confirmations by local magistrates. The bureaucratic nature of the census also meant that a plethora of record-keeping practices emerged. with regulations dictating how forms were to be stored, accessed, and maintained. Censors and their assistants were required to keep meticulous records of all completed forms, ensuring that they were preserved for future reference. This commitment to record-keeping reflected the Romans' understanding of the importance of historical documentation, as these records would one day serve as vital sources for administrative continuity and policy formulation. Part 10, Supply Chain and Logistics. The logistical challenges associated with the Roman census were considerable, requiring a well-oiled machine of supply chain management to ensure that the process ran smoothly. The sheer scale of the empire meant that census materials needed to be transported across vast distances, from the bustling cities of Rome to the remote villages of Britannia and the deserts of North Africa. The first step in the logistical process involved the procurement of materials. Wax tablets, papyrus, and parchment were essential for the completion of census forms, and sourcing these materials posed a significant challenge. The Roman government established supply lines that relied on both local production and importation from regions renowned for their writing materials. For instance, papyrus was primarily sourced from Egypt, where the Nile provided the necessary conditions for the growth of the papyrus plant. The transportation of these materials involved a complex network of roads, rivers, and sea routes, necessitating the coordination of various transport methods, including cart, ship, and mule. Once the materials were in place, the next phase involved the distribution of census forms to local officials. This process often required the establishment of regional depots where forms could be stored and dispatched as needed. Local magistrates were responsible for collecting completed forms from their respective regions and ensuring they were forwarded to the central administrative offices in Rome. The efficiency of this supply chain was paramount, as delays could lead to inaccuracies and complications in the data collection process. Moreover, the logistics extended beyond mere transportation; it also encompassed communication. The Roman Empire was equipped with an extensive network of messengers, known as cursus publicus, who were tasked with delivering important documents, including census forms, between various points of the empire. The speed and reliability of this communication system were crucial, as timely updates on census completion could affect tax assessments and military recruitment strategies. Part 11, Record-keeping methods. The methods employed for record-keeping during the Roman census were sophisticated, reflecting the empire's commitment to administrative efficiency. The Romans utilized a variety of materials and techniques to ensure that census data were accurately recorded and preserved for posterity. The earliest methods involved the use of wax tablets, which were portable and easily erasable, allowing census takers to make adjustments on the fly. This flexibility was particularly advantageous in the field when dealing with discrepancies or when new information emerged. However, wax tablets had limitations, particularly regarding long-term storage, as the wax could wear away over time. Consequently, as the census evolved, so too did the materials used for record-keeping. Papyrus, favored for its durability and ease of writing, became the standard for more permanent records. The transition to papyrus coincided with the increased complexity of census forms, necessitating a medium that could accommodate detailed entries. Scribes utilized reed pens to inscribe data meticulously, and while the writing process was labor-intensive, it resulted in a more reliable and enduring record. In addition to the physical materials, the Romans implemented a variety of organizational strategies for their records. Completed census forms were often compiled into larger registers or lists, which were then categorized by region, demographic details, and economic classifications. These compilations enabled easier access to information and facilitated the analysis of trends over time. The meticulous nature of Roman record-keeping extended to the safeguarding of these records. Archives were established in various cities to house the census records, with dedicated officials responsible for maintaining the integrity of the documents. These archives were typically located in public buildings, such as basilicas or administrative centers, where they could be accessed by authorized personnel only. In summary, the record-keeping methods employed during the Roman census were a testament to the empire's administrative prowess. From the initial use of wax tablets to the widespread adoption of papyrus, coupled with organizational strategies that ensured data integrity, the Romans set a standard for record-keeping practices that would influence subsequent civilizations. #Conclusion. In conclusion, the history of Roman census form completion guidelines is a complex and multifaceted narrative that encompasses regional variations, bureaucratic regulations, logistical challenges, and record-keeping methods. The evolution of these guidelines reflects the empire's adaptability and commitment to efficient governance, while the intricate details of the process reveal a profound understanding of the importance of accurate data collection. As we delve deeper into this tedious history, we appreciate not only the mundane aspects of census completion but also the significant impact these practices had on the administration of one of history's most remarkable empires. The Tedious History of Roman Census Form Completion Guidelines, Part 8. In the annals of Roman history, the census remains a pivotal, albeit often overlooked, mechanism through which the empire maintained its vast territories and diverse populations. The nuances of census form completion reveal a remarkable tapestry of regional variations, the evolution of guidelines over time, the intricate bureaucratic regulations that govern these processes, the logistics involved in their execution, and the methods of record keeping. Each of these aspects warrants an exhaustive exploration, as they collectively contribute to our understanding of the Roman administrative machine. Regional variations and comparisons. To fully grasp the complexities of census form completion, one must first acknowledge the striking regional variations that characterize the implementation of these guidelines across the Roman Empire. The empire, at its zenith, encompassed a wide array of cultures, languages, and administrative practices. Consequently, the census was not a monolithic process. Rather, it was subject to local adaptations that reflected the unique socio-economic conditions of each province. In regions such as Gaul, the census was conducted with a degree of informality that would seem alien to the rigid structures favored in the heart of Rome. Local magistrates often had the discretion to modify census procedures to accommodate the unique needs and customs of their communities. For instance, in the provinces of Hispania, officials would sometimes allow for verbal declarations of property and household composition, recognizing the challenges posed by illiteracy in rural areas. Such practices starkly contrasted with the meticulous documentation required in regions like Italy, where literacy rates were higher, and the expectation for accuracy was paramount. Moreover, the variation in regional languages played a significant role in the completion of census forms. In the eastern provinces, where Greek was prevalent, census forms were often translated into the local dialects to facilitate comprehension. This translation process, while seemingly mundane, often led to discrepancies in the interpretation of terms related to property ownership, citizenship status, and family lineage, thereby complicating the overall accuracy of the census data collected. Evolution over different time periods. The evolution of census form completion guidelines is intrinsically linked to the broader historical context of the Roman Empire. From the early Republic to the late Empire, the procedures surrounding the census underwent considerable transformation, reflecting shifts in political power, societal structure, and economic conditions. In the early days of the Republic, the census served not only as a tool for taxation but also as a means of military conscription. Consequently, the emphasis was placed on recording eligible male citizens who could serve in the legions. The forms utilized during this period were relatively straightforward, often comprising a simple enumeration of males aged 18 to 60, along with basic property assessments. As the empire expanded, the complexity of governance necessitated a more nuanced approach to census completion. By the time of Augustus, the census had evolved into a far more comprehensive instrument of statecraft. The guidelines now require detailed information about the entire household, including women, children, and slaves. The forms mandated the disclosure of property values, types of assets, and even debts owed, reflecting the increasing sophistication of Roman economic structures. Furthermore, the late Empire witnessed a marked shift in the priorities of census taking. With the decline of the traditional agrarian economy and the rise of urban centers, the focus of census forms began to shift towards urban populations, necessitating adaptations to accommodate the unique dynamics of city life. This evolution illustrated not only the changing demographics of the Roman world but also the empire's response to the complexities of urban governance. Bureaucratic regulations and laws. The bureaucratic regulations governing census form completion were extensive and often labyrinthine, reflecting the Roman penchant for legalism. The Lex Julia de Census, enacted during the reign of Augustus, established a framework of laws that dictated the procedures for conducting the census and the penalties for noncompliance. These regulations were meticulously crafted to ensure uniformity and accuracy across the empire, yet they also introduced layers of complexity that could baffle even the most seasoned bureaucrat. Under this legal framework, local officials were mandated to oversee the census process, with specific guidelines delineating their responsibilities. They were required to ensure that all eligible citizens were accounted for, which often necessitated extensive door-to-door inquiries. Failure to comply with these regulations could result in penalties ranging from fines to exile, underscoring the serious nature of census completion. Moreover, the laws surrounding the census were not static. They evolved in response to the shifting political landscape. For instance, during the reign of Diocletian, a series of reforms aimed at stabilizing the empire included the introduction of more rigorous census regulations. These reforms emphasized the need for greater accountability and transparency in the census process, leading to the establishment of a more structured hierarchy of officials tasked with overseeing the census at various administrative levels. Supply chain and logistics. The logistical challenges of conducting a census in the sprawling Roman Empire cannot be overstated. The sheer scale of the undertaking required meticulous planning and coordination among various administrative units. The logistical infrastructure of the empire, which included a vast network of roads and communication systems, played a critical role in facilitating the census process. The movement of census officials, materials, and data across the provinces posed significant challenges. Local magistrates were often responsible for procuring the necessary resources to conduct the census, including writing materials, ink, and even food supplies for the officials conducting the enumeration. The procurement process was rarely straightforward. It involved navigating local markets, negotiating prices, and ensuring that the supplies met the standards set forth by the central authorities. In addition, the transportation of completed census forms back to the central administration in Rome was fraught with difficulties. Forms were often transported via a combination of foot travel and cart, which could be slow and cumbersome, especially in remote provinces. The risk of loss or damage during transit was ever present, leading to calls for more secure methods of transport, such as the use of official couriers. Such measures, while effective, added additional layers of complexity to an already intricate process. Record-keeping methods. The methods of record-keeping employed during the census were as varied as the regions themselves. In the early stages of the Roman Republic, census records were maintained on wax tablets, which were portable but prone to damage and degradation over time. The use of wax tablets necessitated a reliable system for copying and archiving records, as the loss of a tablet could result in the permanent erasure of vital demographic data. As the empire expanded and the need for more durable records became apparent, the use of parchment began to emerge as a favored medium. Parchment offered a greater degree of longevity and allowed for the meticulous documentation of census data. However, the transition to parchment was not without its challenges. The procurement of high-quality parchment was often expensive, and the process of creating and maintaining these records was labor-intensive. The introduction of the codex format during the later periods of the empire revolutionized record-keeping practices. The codex, which comprised multiple pages bound together, allowed for easier referencing and organization of census data. This innovation facilitated the systematic categorization of information, enabling officials to quickly access demographic statistics for various regions. Moreover, the advent of numeracy and literacy campaigns, particularly during the reign of Augustus, contributed to the improvement of record-keeping practices. Increased literacy among the populace meant that more individuals could participate in the census process, whether as enumerators or as subjects of enumeration. This shift not only enhanced the accuracy of the data collected but also fostered a greater sense of civic responsibility among citizens. In conclusion, the history of Roman census form completion guidelines is a rich tapestry woven from the threads of regional diversity, bureaucratic complexity, logistical challenges, and evolving record-keeping methods. Each of these elements contributed to the overall efficacy of the census as a tool of governance, reflecting the intricate relationship between administrative practices and the socio-political realities of the Roman Empire. While the topic may seem tedious at first glance, a closer examination reveals a fascinating interplay of factors that ultimately shaped the course of Roman history. Regional variations and comparisons. Throughout the sprawling expanse of the Roman Empire, the implementation of census form completion guidelines exhibited notable regional variations, intricately influenced by local customs, administrative practices, and cultural nuances. These discrepancies were not merely anecdotal, they reflected the complex tapestry of governance that characterized Rome's multifaceted society. In the provinces of Gaul, for instance, the census procedures were often modified to accommodate the unique social structures and languages of the indigenous populations. The Gauls, with their diverse tribal affiliations, necessitated a tailored approach that diverged from the standardized Roman practices prevalent in the heart of the empire. In contrast, the provinces of Africa, particularly Carthage, showcased a different approach. The Roman authorities, keen on maintaining control over the economically significant North African territories, implemented stringent regulations that mirrored the bureaucratic rigidity of Rome itself. The census forms used in Africa often included additional sections to capture agricultural yields, a reflection of the region's reliance on its fertile lands. This agricultural emphasis contrasted sharply with the urban-centric data collection seen in the bustling streets of Rome, where the focus was predominantly on population density and occupational classifications. In the eastern provinces, particularly in areas influenced by Hellenistic traditions, the census processes were infused with local practices that sometimes perplexed Roman officials. The incorporation of Greek language and customs into the census forms, such as the inclusion of philosophical affiliations and educational status, illustrated how regional variations could lead to a rich amalgamation of bureaucratic practices, albeit at the potential cost of efficiency. This blending of cultures not only complicated the census process but also enriched the data collected, providing a more nuanced understanding of the populace. The comparative analysis of these regional variations reveals an underlying principle: the Roman Empire, while striving for uniformity in governance, was constantly negotiating the delicate balance between central authority and local autonomy. The local adaptations of census completion guidelines served as a testament to the empire's resilience and adaptability, allowing it to govern effectively over disparate and often conflicting cultures. Evolution over different time periods. The evolution of the Roman census form completion guidelines is a chronicle of adaptation and reform, evolving in tandem with the empire's shifting socio-political landscape. In the early Republic, the census was primarily a tool for determining military service eligibility and taxation. The completion of census forms was a straightforward affair, often involving a simple declaration of one's household and property. This rudimentary system, while functional, lacked the complexity needed to address the growing intricacies of Roman society as it expanded. As the empire transitioned into the late Republic and subsequently the early Empire, the census underwent significant transformations. The introduction of more detailed demographic data collection reflected the empire's increasing need for sophisticated governance. By the time of Augustus, the census had evolved into a comprehensive instrument for not only gauging population size but also for understanding social stratification and economic potential. The census forms began to demand additional information such as age, gender, occupation, and even social status, indicating a shift towards a more bureaucratically informed governance model. During the late Empire, especially under Diocletian and Constantine, the census evolved yet again in response to mounting administrative challenges and economic turbulence. The forms became even more elaborate, incorporating information about landholdings, livestock, and production capabilities, essential data for a state grappling with the complexities of a dwindling economy and the need for efficient resource allocation. The introduction of census intervals, initially every 5 years, was expanded to a more flexible system, reflecting both the challenges of logistics and the imperatives of governance in a time of crisis. Thus, the evolution of census form completion guidelines can be seen as a mirror to the broader historical currents affecting the Roman Empire, each modification and reform echoing the pressing demands of its time, whether they be military, economic, or social in nature. Bureaucratic regulations and laws. The establishment of bureaucratic regulations and laws surrounding the completion of census forms was a critical aspect of maintaining order within the vast Roman Empire. The legal framework governing these procedures was often intricate and layered, reflecting the complex interplay between the central government and local authorities. The Lex Julia, enacted in 18 BCE, was one of the foundational legal texts that outlined the parameters of the census process, mandating regular enumeration and specifying penalties for non-compliance. As the empire expanded, additional laws were enacted to address the unique challenges posed by diverse populations. For example, specific regulations were introduced to facilitate the completion of census forms among newly conquered territories, which often included provisions for language translation and cultural sensitivity. These laws were essential not only for ensuring compliance but also for fostering a sense of inclusion among the newly integrated populations. The bureaucratic machinery of the Roman state was further complicated by the presence of various administrative offices tasked with overseeing census operations. Officials known as censors played a pivotal role in this process, responsible for not only conducting the census but also for enforcing adherence to the regulations. These censors were vested with significant power, including the ability to impose fines and penalties on those who failed to complete their forms accurately or on time. Such powers were crucial for maintaining the integrity of the census data, which in turn informed critical decisions regarding taxation, military conscription, and resource allocation. In addition to these regulations, the bureaucracy surrounding census form completion was characterized by a myriad of procedural guidelines that dictated everything from the format of the forms themselves to the methods employed in data collection. The use of wax tablets for recording information, for instance, was a common practice, allowing for easy amendments and updates as new data became available. The bureaucratic emphasis on meticulous record-keeping underscored the importance placed on accuracy and reliability within the census process. Supply chain and logistics. The logistical challenges associated with the completion of census forms in the Roman Empire were considerable, requiring a well-orchestrated supply chain to ensure the effective dissemination and collection of data. The sheer scale of the empire, encompassing diverse geographical terrains, from the rolling hills of Italy to the arid landscapes of North Africa, complicated the logistics of census operations. The transportation of census forms and the mobilization of census takers necessitated a comprehensive understanding of the empire's infrastructure, including its road networks, shipping routes, and available resources. The Roman road system, renowned for its engineering prowess, played a crucial role in facilitating these logistical operations. Well-maintained roads allowed for efficient travel by census officials, who were tasked with overseeing the completion of forms across various regions. The establishment of way stations, known as mutations, provided essential support for these officials, offering rest and resources as they traversed the empire in pursuit of accurate data collection. Moreover, the timing of the census was intricately tied to agricultural cycles and climatic conditions. In regions where agriculture was the primary economic activity, census operations were often scheduled post-harvest to capture the most accurate economic data. This consideration for local agricultural practices illustrated the Roman state's awareness of the interdependence between population data and economic realities, ensuring that the census served not only as a bureaucratic exercise but as a vital tool for informed governance. The supply chain logistics extended beyond mere transportation. It also encompassed the materials needed for census form completion. The production of writing materials, such as papyrus and ink, was a significant industry in ancient Rome. Ensuring that census takers had access to these materials at the right time and place was paramount for the smooth execution of the census process. The cultivation of papyrus in regions like Egypt and the sourcing of quality inks from various provinces represented a complex web of trade and supply dynamics that underpinned the bureaucratic functions of the Roman Empire. Record-keeping methods. The methods employed for record-keeping during the Roman census were both varied and sophisticated, reflecting the empire's commitment to data accuracy and administrative efficiency. The primary medium for recording census data was the wax tablet, a versatile and reusable tool that allowed for easy modification of entries. These tablets, inscribed with a stylus, could be smoothed over and rewritten, making them ideal for capturing dynamic information that might change during the census period. In addition to wax tablets, the use of parchment and papyrus became increasingly prevalent, especially as the empire expanded and the demand for more permanent records grew. The transition to these more durable materials marked a significant evolution in record-keeping practices, as they allowed for the preservation of census data over longer periods. This shift was particularly important for maintaining historical records of population changes, taxation trends, and resource allocations, which were vital for strategic planning and governance. The organization of census records was also a critical aspect of the process. Records were often maintained in a hierarchical manner, with local censuses aggregated into regional datasets, which were subsequently compiled at the imperial level. This multi-tiered approach facilitated a comprehensive understanding of demographic trends across the empire, enabling Roman officials to make informed decisions based on a holistic view of the population. The archival practices surrounding census records varied by region, with some provinces establishing dedicated archives to house these vital documents. The preservation of census data was not merely an administrative function, it played a crucial role in the socio-economic fabric of Roman society. Accurate record-keeping allowed for the equitable distribution of resources, informed military conscription, and ensured that taxation was based on reliable data, a cornerstone of effective governance in a complex empire. In conclusion, the meticulous history of Roman census form completion guidelines, enriched by regional variations, evolving regulations, logistical challenges, and sophisticated record-keeping methods, serves as a fascinating lens through which to view the complexities of Roman governance. This seemingly mundane topic, when explored in excessive detail, reveals the intricate web of bureaucratic practices that underpinned one of history's most enduring empires. ###The Tedious History of Roman Census Form Completion Guidelines, Part 10. ###Regional Variations and Comparisons. The Roman Empire, an entity of sprawling proportions, was characterized by a remarkable diversity of cultures, languages, and administrative systems. This diversity inevitably influenced the execution of census form completion, leading to notable regional variations. Each province, from the verdant hills of Gaul to the arid expanses of Judea, possessed its own set of peculiarities and practices regarding the census. In Gaul, for instance, the census was not merely a bureaucratic exercise but often became a communal affair. Local chieftains would gather their people in the central agora, where they would recount their numbers in a public forum. This practice, though seemingly inefficient, fostered a sense of community and identity among the Gallic tribes. The forms completed during this process reflected not only the population numbers but also the social hierarchy, as the tribes would often denote the status of individuals within the forms, a practice less prevalent in other regions. Conversely, in the arid landscapes of Judea, the census was often met with resistance. The Jewish population was particularly wary of Roman authorities, viewing the census as an imposition of foreign domination. Thus, compliance was typically marked by a degree of reluctance. The census forms in this region often included a unique section for religious observance, allowing respondents to indicate their adherence to specific traditions and practices. This detail highlighted a cultural sensitivity not universally present in other provinces. In the eastern provinces, such as Asia Minor, the census was influenced by local customs and the Hellenistic tradition of civic participation. Here, the census was often tied to the local city-state's governance, requiring citizens to not only provide demographic data but also to participate in various civic duties as outlined in the census guidelines. The forms used in these regions were often adorned with local symbols and inscriptions, making them visually distinct from their counterparts in the western provinces. ###Evolution over different time periods. As the Roman Empire transitioned from the Republic to the imperial phase, the guidelines surrounding census form completion evolved significantly. During the early Republic, the census was relatively straightforward, focusing primarily on headcounts and property assessments. However, as the empire expanded, the complexity of the census grew, necessitating more detailed record-keeping and systematic approaches. By the late Republic, the introduction of the census reform by Gaius Gracchus in 123 BCE marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of census practices. This reform mandated that citizens provide comprehensive details regarding their wealth and property, thereby increasing the scope of the census forms. The administrative burden placed on local magistrates intensified, leading to a more structured set of guidelines for form completion. With the advent of the imperial era, particularly under Augustus, the census underwent profound changes. The establishment of the census imperium introduced a state-controlled census system that mandated rigorous compliance. The forms now required not only demographic data but also detailed economic information. This shift towards an extensive bureaucratic model necessitated the implementation of more elaborate guidelines, as officials were required to ensure that the data collected could support an increasingly complex system of taxation and governance. The guidelines continued to evolve through the Severan dynasty, where the introduction of the census of 212 CE expanded the criteria for inclusion. For the first time, free inhabitants of the empire, including those previously classified as non-citizens, were required to be counted. This expansion necessitated further modifications to the census forms, which now had to accommodate a broader demographic spectrum and capture more nuanced information regarding social status and economic activity. ########Bureaucratic regulations and laws. The Roman bureaucracy surrounding the census was underpinned by an intricate web of regulations and laws designed to ensure the accuracy and efficiency of data collection. The Lex Julia de Civitate established the legal framework for citizenship and, by extension, census participation. This law stipulated that all eligible citizens were required to register during the census, with penalties imposed for non-compliance. The bureaucratic oversight was primarily the responsibility of local magistrates, who were often tasked with ensuring the correct completion of census forms. These magistrates were governed by strict guidelines that dictated how forms should be administered, collected, and processed. For instance, a decree from the time of Emperor Augustus specified that census forms must be distributed in a standardized format, complete with designated sections for demographic information, property holdings, and social status. The laws surrounding the census also mandated regular intervals for census completion. Initially conducted every 5 years, the frequency of the census was later adjusted in response to administrative needs and political pressures. The Lex Fuefia Caninia of 2 BCE introduced a more flexible schedule, allowing for more frequent censuses in regions deemed economically significant to the empire. This adaptability showcased the Roman bureaucracy's capacity to respond to the diverse and shifting needs of its vast territories. Moreover, the penalties for inaccuracies or omissions in census reporting were severe. Local officials faced potential fines or even loss of office if they failed to ensure the correctness of the data collected. This pressure to maintain accuracy fostered a culture of meticulousness among bureaucrats, who often resorted to multiple levels of verification to ensure compliance with the established guidelines. #####supply chain and logistics. The logistical challenges associated with census form completion in the Roman Empire were formidable, particularly given the vast geographic expanse and the diverse populations involved. The distribution of the census forms, collection of completed documents, and subsequent data processing required a well-coordinated supply chain. At the outset of the census cycle, local magistrates were responsible for procuring census forms from regional administrative centers. These forms were typically produced on papyrus or wax tablets, each requiring careful handling to prevent damage or loss. The transportation of these materials often involved a complex network of couriers and local officials, who were charged with ensuring that forms reached their designated locations in a timely manner. Once distributed, the completed forms were collected and sent back to the central authorities for processing. This return journey was equally intricate, often necessitating the use of local roads, river transport, or even maritime routes, depending on the region. The Roman road system, lauded for its engineering prowess, played a crucial role in facilitating this logistical operation. However, the condition of these roads varied significantly across the empire, presenting challenges that could delay the collection of census data. Moreover, the sheer volume of data generated by the census necessitated the establishment of dedicated processing centers, where clerks would transcribe and compile the information. The logistics of staffing these centers were also significant, as skilled clerks were in high demand. The emphasis on accuracy meant that these clerks were often required to undergo intensive training, further complicating the supply chain associated with census processing. ######record keeping methods. The methods employed by the Romans for record keeping during the census were a reflection of their broader administrative capabilities. Initially, records were maintained in a relatively informal manner, with local magistrates relying on oral traditions and rudimentary written notes. However, as the complexity of the census grew, so too did the sophistication of record-keeping practices. One of the most significant developments in this area was the introduction of the tabulae, or tablets, which served as the primary medium for recording census data. These tablets were typically made of wood, coated with wax, or crafted from clay, and provided a durable surface for inscribing information. The use of styluses for writing on wax tablets allowed for corrections and modifications, a practicality that was essential given the dynamic nature of the census process. In addition to tabulae, the Romans also utilized scrolls for more extensive documentation. These scrolls were often employed to compile cumulative census data, allowing for easier reference and analysis by higher authorities. The practice of archiving these records in a centralized location further enhanced the efficiency of data retrieval and analysis, a foresight that would later benefit future generations of historians. The incorporation of systematic categorization methods, such as the use of alphabetical indexing and numerical coding, further advanced Roman record-keeping practices. This meticulous attention to detail ensured that the vast amounts of data generated during the census could be efficiently organized and accessed by officials, thus facilitating more informed decision-making. #####conclusion. In summation, the history of Roman census form completion guidelines is a rich tapestry woven with regional variations, evolving practices, bureaucratic regulations, logistical challenges, and record-keeping methods. Each of these elements contributed to a complex system that not only reflected the administrative prowess of the Roman Empire but also highlighted the unique cultural contexts of its diverse provinces. As we delve deeper into this tedious history, it becomes evident that the seemingly mundane aspects of census completion were essential to the functioning of one of history's most remarkable empires. The legacy of these practices continues to resonate today, reminding us of the intricate relationship between governance, population management, and the necessity for accurate record-keeping in any society aiming for stability and prosperity. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of our tranquil journey through the tedious history of Roman census form completion guidelines. We hope this exploration into the meticulous world of ancient bureaucracy has provided you with a soothing backdrop to ease your mind and prepare you for a restful night. As we wandered through the intricacies of Roman society, we uncovered how census-taking was not just a matter of counting heads but a reflection of the empire's structure, culture, and governance. From the early days of Rome, where each citizen was essential in shaping the fabric of the republic, to the more complex procedures of the empire, we traced the evolution of these guidelines that, while seemingly mundane, were vital in maintaining order and understanding within such a vast territory. We delved into the various roles citizens played, the significance of accurate record-keeping, and how these practices laid the groundwork for modern census methods. The nuances of Roman life, intertwined with their census practices, remind us of the importance of community and the relationships that bind us together, even in the simplest of tasks. As we reflect on this journey, let your mind drift gently towards the comfort of sleep. Allow the calming rhythms of this narrative to wash over you, easing away the stresses of the day. Remember, dear listener, that it is perfectly alright to replay this voyage whenever you need a moment of serenity or a gentle reminder of the past. The echoes of history can cradle you into a peaceful slumber, a reminder that even the most tedious tasks have their place in the tapestry of life. As you nestle into your dreams, may you find tranquility and warmth. Let the thoughts of ancient Rome fade softly into the background, replaced by the soothing sounds of your breath and the gentle embrace of the night. May your dreams be filled with peace, and may you awaken refreshed and renewed, ready to embrace a new day. Thank you for joining us on this serene exploration. We hope to accompany you again, sharing more stories that soothe the soul and calm the mind. Until then, we wish you a restful night filled with sweet dreams and gentle whispers of history. Good night, dear listeners. May the stars watch over you as you drift into a peaceful sleep.